Good evening. My name is Terrence Williams. I'm the Dean of Studies here at Pendle Hill, and I wanted to welcome you all. We will be enjoying a wonderful talk this evening by Mr. Steve Chase. Before that, you will hear from our Executive Director, Jennifer Karsten. Steve will speak for about an hour, and then we will enjoy some time for question and answer afterwards. And we will end at 9 p.m., and you can feel free to socialize in the lobby area as well as enjoy our bookstore that will be open. If you could take a second now to ensure that anything that you have on you that might make noise, watches, cell phones, etc., is silenced. We'll pass the microphone to Jennifer, who will introduce Steve.
Thank you, Terrence. Thank you, everyone, for coming to Pendle Hill for the 2013 Cary Lecture with Steve Chase. I actually have the honor of introducing two Steves this evening, because before I say a bit about Steve Chase, our lecturer, I'd like to bring into the room the legacy of Steve Cary, the person for whom this yearly lecture is named. Steve Cary was a Quaker whose life spoke of his commitment to the religious society of Friends, as well as peace and justice in the world. He was a fun-loving, tough-minded, witty, and smart man who told great stories. During World War II, he was a conscientious objector. In the 40s, he was in the civilian public service. For nearly 25 years, he worked for the American Friends Service Committee in various positions. He was the clerk of their board. He was instrumental in that 1955 publication of Speak Truth to Power. In the 60s and 70s, his activism brought him to travel to South Vietnam, to protest the war in front of the White House with a week-long fast with other clergymen, and to engage in civil disobedience with the Poor People's Campaign, which led to a jail stint in Washington, D.C. He went on to serve as a board member with Haverford College and to give a year as acting president there. He was a longtime clerk of Germantown Monthly Meeting, and that included 15 years clerking the Germantown Friends Schools Committee. Following his death at age 86 in 2002, his dear friends Norval and Ann Reese provided for the publication of his speeches, writings, and memoirs in the book Intrepid Quaker, available at the Pendle Hill bookstore. And they created an endowment to support a yearly lecture here at Pendle Hill so that we could lift up voices of those friends whose life contributions are reminiscent of Steve's gifts and energies. And our speaker tonight is one of those people, and it's now my delight to introduce him to you. Steve Chase is a member of Putney Friends Meeting in Vermont. But in 1968, Steve was a 13-year-old in Galesburg, Illinois, and not yet aware of Quakers. The year before, he'd heard Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech out of Riverside Church, and it had really influenced his inner world, but it hadn't yet influenced his outer world. And so it was a hot summer day, and he found himself at his Boy Scout Jamboree in Galesburg, Illinois, and on the corner of the square, there was a peace vigil, a small group of people there, and he felt himself drawn to them, but nervously so. This was in contrast to his Midwestern upbringing. And he thought about the courage that had been imprinted on him by King in that speech that he heard, and he felt drawn over to the peace vigil. So he went over tentatively, and just as he had settled into about a minute of time with these people, his scoutmaster came over furious, grabbed his clothes, pulled him out of line, and screamed at him that he was a traitor, a communist, a disgrace to the Boy Scout uniform, and shoved him and stormed off. And so the 13-year-old Steve was there, and he was approached by an elderly woman from the vigil who came up and gently put her hand on his shoulder and said, "I'm sorry for what just happened to you, and you'll always be welcome in a Quaker meeting." And that's how we got him. Later, Steve earned his master's and doctoral degrees at Antioch University. He was one of the founding directors and is currently director of their environmental advocacy and organizing program for graduate students. And it's one of the first of the kind in the country. It's a place where they've made space in the Academy for social justice education. He teaches courses such as organizing social movements and campaigns, corporate power, globalization, and democracy. And he's a member of the National Organizers Alliance, called upon as a trainer to help people find their call to action. Just last summer here, he led a terrific, well-attended session for young adult friends on the topic of creative maladjustment. Steve's writing has been published in many journals and magazines, and he's served on the editorial board for several more, including Orion Magazine. The books he has authored include Defending the Earth, a dialogue between Murray Bookchin and David Foreman, and also Letters to a Fellow Traveler, available in the Pendle Hill bookstore. A short introduction to the Quaker Way. This latter was the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting 2012 choice for their One Book, One Yearly Meeting program, and so many area Quakers and Quaker curious have read it. Tonight, Steve will address the topic of revelation and revolution. Quaker activism as a path toward faithfulness. Friends, it is our practice to settle into silence and let our speakers speak out of that silence. Tonight, Steve is accompanied by a friend from his meeting, Sadie Forsyth, who will read a minute out of that silence. When she's seated, we'll re-enter silence, and then Steve will welcome your message from that point.
Good evening, friends. My name is Sadie Forsyth, a member of Putney Friends Meeting, so it's my delight and privilege to get to read Steve's travel minute from our home meeting. Actually, for a second time here at Pendle Hill, I had the opportunity to accompany him when he spoke to the young adult program here last summer. So Steve, I'm glad to welcome you back to Philadelphia. And luckily for us, his minute is included in his book, so I just have to find the correct page. See, I was looking in the beginning, so we're here. So many ways. So keeping with the long Quaker tradition of supporting our traveling ministers, I bring you this word from Putney Friends Meeting. Dear friends in New England Yearly Meeting and beyond, we at Putney Friends Meeting are writing in support of the traveling ministry of Steve Chase. Steve is a treasured member of Putney Friends Meeting, who has long shared a gift for prophetic and soulful ministry in our meetings for worship. He is increasingly called to share his ministry with friends and others, whether through his writing, speaking, or leading workshops or retreats. We can attest that Steve's work in the traveling ministry is deeply rooted in loving God with all our heart, soul, and strength, loving our neighbors as ourselves, and loving God's good earth by acting in unity with creation. We trust you will welcome Steve into your community, show him every hospitality, care for his spiritual life while he is among you, and hope that you will be uplifted by his ministry in whatever form it takes. Sincerely, Carol Forsyth, Clerk of Putney Friends Meeting. And Steve will speak out of the silence, as Jen said. Thank you.
So Jennifer sent me this book about 3 months ago. And I had never heard of Steve Cary. But I was intrigued and I loved the idea of being able to come back to Pendle Hill. This room has meant so much to me so many times. And I love that you mentioned that Steve was an amazing storyteller. And that's what won me over from the first page and just kept me all the way through. Because I happen to believe, along with Jewish poet, I just love this quote. I think it's Muriel Rukeyser. And she says, and I'm beginning to believe it, that the universe is made of stories, not atoms. And I know that my faith, and I think Steve Cary's faith, is made of stories, not doctrines. The embedded stories of people who, in his words, cultivate daily awareness and communion with the divine in order to find the strength to resist evil wherever you find it and build up what he called community and what Martin Luther King called beloved community and what our early Quaker ancestors called the peaceable kingdom, the rule of love, the covenant of peace, many different Latin words for the kingdom of God. And Steve came to a faith that I came to as well, that what Quakerism meant to Steve was to follow the way of Jesus, to seek and do God's will in all times, at all times, in all settings. The thing I love about Steve is this did not make him a quietist, gray, dowdy, just uptight person. This guy was mischievous. This guy talked about faithfulness as a happy adventure. And what I love about reading that is that it's so similar to that day where I got kicked out of Boy Scouts and the next day went to my first Quaker meeting. I went home that day and I said to my mom, "What do you know about Quakers? I only know this funny-faced guy on a box of oatmeal." And she knew some stuff, and she started telling me, and one thing that interests me, she says, "You know your dad, how he hates religion?" I go, "Yeah, well, he gives money to the American Friends Service." And because he likes their peace work, he likes their work in international relief, and even though they're all about this God and Jesus thing, he thinks it's money well spent. And my mom, bless her, said, "Well, you seem kind of interested in this. Why don't you go to the phone book and call up Galesburg Friends meeting?" And I did. And I came to the same sense that Steve did about what is the purpose of Quaker faithfulness. In that moment, I got a bit of it. So I call up, the woman treats me blessedly like a spiritual seeker. I'm 13, I'm a kid, I'm calling up. She could have thought it was a prank. And she takes me seriously and she's answering my questions. And then I asked her, well, where do you meet? And it was, very different from Steve Cary, who went to his first meeting when he was 4. The meeting had been in existence since the 1800s, had been in this meeting house, and he goes to Germantown Friends School, and then he goes to Haverford. Then he's working for the AFC. I mean, he is a professional Eastern Philadelphia Quaker. And I'm a 13-year-old kid on the phone in 1968 saying, "Well, where do you meet?" And they said, "Well, for the last few years, we've been meeting in the living room of one of our members." And so it was a house meeting, and there were like 15 to 18 people who would regularly get there. And I particularly loved when they showed me the library, in the living room, the 2 shelves of books. But I'm on the phone, and I said, "So what is at the core of Quaker faith? What do you really believe?" And she said to me, the best answer to that question I've ever heard. And I've just been trying to live out that answer ever since. She said, "We believe that every man, woman, and child on this planet has the spiritual capacity to experience divine love, presence, and guidance. And that moved me. And then she said, and we believe, we've learned over 350 years that if we pay attention to that, if we listen to that still, small voice of God in our midst, we can heal and transform our personal lives. We can heal and transform our families. We can heal and transform our communities. And we can heal and transform the world. And that is what the two Steves believe. Now, we got there very different ways. One of my favorite stories when I read the book was he's at Haverford, and my nephew's here, just finished his first year at Haverford, and welcome. And so he's at Haverford, and he should be a pretty serious Quaker by this time, given all he's had. And so he's sitting in meeting for worship, and these were the glory days. So he's sitting with people like Rufus Jones, Douglas Steer, Thomas Kelly, and I think Cadbury was still there. And he and his buddies have a betting pool. Because it seems to them that Rufus Jones is pretty frequently called on by God to stand up and speak. And so the question is God going to call Rufus at 5.5 minutes or 7 minutes? And so every week they put in a little money, and whoever nails it gets that. And so that's a pretty serious Quaker right there. But it did get serious for him. And he tells two stories in the book that really moved me. And one is he's living at the Y in Trenton, New Jersey, and he gets a call that he's supposed to go home, and it's time to have a family meeting. And so he goes, he's asking, and they're sitting around, what is it? And his father, who absolutely loves his work, is working at a company that has now just got several military contracts. And the father says, I always said if that would happen, I would leave my job. But I can't make that decision alone because it impacts all of you. And so Steve Cary is sitting there, and he is a decision maker about his father's future. And all that he learned in first day, all the things he heard about at GFS, all the things he had heard about, including the times he might have actually listened to Rufus Jones rather than worry about who won the pool, came to be crystallized for him. And they all said, yeah, you should leave. And if we have to, and if you're unemployed for a long time, we'll deal with that. We'll figure that out. You should leave. Another story, and this is where our lives touch in a way that I found unexpected, is he's at a diner real close to the Y, and he's sitting there by himself, and he hears three guys having this in-depth conversation, and he hears words like the American Air Force, and he hears words like the American Friends Service Committee. And this is in the late 40s. Fascism is on the march. Hints of the degree of anti-Semitism and what might be coming are already emerging. And two of these guys are from Cornell, and they, sharing Steve's belief, they have to do something to resist evil. And so they're going to sign up. And Steve is confronted with this sort of nominal, enveloping Quaker sense of things, but is it his own? Does he really believe this? Does he feel that nonviolent resistance could possibly be the way to go forward? And the other person that's talking is Joe Havens. And Joe is a as a friend of mine. And so that was a friend of mine. And Joe would have these things where he would say, Steve, why don't you come to Temenos and we'll have a consultation? And I would go and he would listen to me and give me sage advice. And this was the person that inspired Steve to really grapple with what does it mean to follow Jesus. And there's a great story where it says somebody came up, a journalist came up to Gandhi and said, so, okay, you have a different religion from Christians. What fundamentally makes you different from Christians around the world? Gandhi stood for a while and he said, well, when Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, I think he meant it. And so Steve came to the moment where I think Jesus meant it. I think I'm a disciple of Jesus, a friend and follower of Jesus. I think I'm going to have to find a way to fight evil that's different. That you cannot be neutral in the face of justice being trounced by injustice. But how do you fight it? And that became a guiding feature of his life. Now, I didn't have all the seeds that were planted to create that in the same way that Steve did in terms of just being a Quaker from 4 on, both my parents being Quaker. But I have to say, seeds were planted for me. And we recently had Mother's Day, and so I just want to do a shout out to my mom. Because there's a Catholic theologian, I think his name's Richard Rorty, who says that anybody who speaks truth to you is a mere echo of the Holy Spirit. But by God, we need those echoes. We need those people around. And my mom was my first spiritual teacher. And for Steve, one of the awakening moments was when he's traveling all over Europe after the war. And he is seeing huge evil. He is seeing the results of both Nazism, and he's also seeing the results of the Allied powers and what they have done to cities like Dresden, and governments being broken and non-functional, and people being impoverished and not knowing where their food is coming from, and people also starting to, they've lost trust, they've lost bonds. They're going me and my family and not my neighbor. And how to deal with this, he's addressing. And with my mom, I never saw any of that. But my mom one time, I think I was about 6, and I had heard the word Holocaust. And so I went up to my mom and I said, what's the Holocaust? As a parent today, I cannot even imagine how terrifying it would be to have a 6-year-old child come up to you and say, what's the Holocaust? But my mom, she didn't pull any punches. She told me of 11 million people being exterminated, 6 million of them Jews. She told me about fascism and the loss of freedom and the brutalization of people, and she's telling a 6-year-old, her beloved child, how absolutely depraved human beings can be. But she doesn't leave the story there. My mom tells me, well, in Denmark, under the Nazi occupation, a lot of the Gentiles said, we're not going to allow the Nazis to divide us. We're Danish people. Gentiles and Jews are going to hang together. And when the Nazi decree came out that all the Jews had to wear Stars of David on their clothes, hundreds of thousands of Gentiles, including the Danish king, sewed the Star of David. And so in the moment that I'm touching something unimaginably awful, my mom tells me this story of how human beings can rise to the moment. And they can be forgiving, and they can be brave, and they can take risks, and they can act in solidarity. And she says to me, if you're ever in a situation where you're the target of something like that, reach out for other people. If you're ever in a situation where other people are the target like that, figure out a way to help them. And my mom, bless her, often says that I imprinted as a kid on Martin Luther King, like a duckling imprints on the first adult. But the reality is I imprinted on my mom. And she would call me in. We had this ritual where she'd be in the family room. She always watched the news at 6. And anything about the civil rights movement came on when I was little. She'd say, Stevie, come in. And I would curl up in her arms. And I would watch demonstrations. And I would watch speeches by King. And I would just have a sense, as much as you could get from TV, being, a 7 or 8-year-old kid in Galesburg, Illinois, in the comfort of your mother's arms, in your family room, of something big was going on. And I remember, I think I would have been 8, that the fire hoses, I'm watching her, the fire hoses are hitting black men, women, and children for standing up for something as simple as basic dignity and basic rights that all of the other people in their community have. And they're hitting the walls and they're going down, and I'm horrified, but I'm in my mom's arms, and these people keep standing up again and again and again. And my mom says, Stevie, these are God's people. When you grow up, I really, really want you to be like them. Which on one hand is kind of a heavy thing to say to an 8-year-old. And I felt at the time a little bit like, well, why me? Why not you? Why me? Why not you? But my mom struggled with, she was never a joiner. But she struggled with what to do. And I remember when she took responsibility. And so I would have been about 9 at this point. And in Galesburg, Illinois, the northwest part of town was a giant lake called Lake Story, and it was open to the public. And I didn't know it, but there was a black beach and there was a white beach. I just thought black people in my town didn't like to go swimming, because all these years I'd been going to the white beach not knowing. But my mom heard about this, and so she started taking us to the black beach. And in Galesburg, there was no law. There was no law of segregation. It was just a pattern of behavior that had become entrenched. And so we're there, and I'm getting to make new friends. This is kind of cool. And it's great. And it's also kind of cool because police cars come up. And policemen walk on the beach, on the sandy beach, and they're walking, and they go up to my mom, and they said, "Ma'am, I really think you're in the wrong place. I think if you went to the other side, you'd be much more comfortable." And she said, "No problem. We're having a great time. Look at my kid. He's running right there. He's having a ball." Well, ma'am, it's just really not quite appropriate. And I'm watching at the corner of my eyes, my mom is talking a cop down. And she finally says to him, "Well, sir, it's not illegal. And if it was, we'd still stay." And as long as I'm in this very crying mood about my mom and Mother's Day, about 6 weeks before my famous moment of losing my Boy Scout membership and becoming a Quaker, is I come down on my birthday, and there's a little package on the table. And so I grab it, and I say, "Oh, great, Mom, thanks." And I rip it open, and it's a copy, and so I was my 13th birthday, and it's a copy of Betty's Friedan, the Feminine. And I open it up, and it has this lovely inscription, which is, "Stevie, today you're becoming a man. Your job is to become a good one. Please read this book." And I did read it, and I hope I'm on the journey of becoming a good man. So these were the seeds that were planted in me that the first time I go to Quaker meeting, and it's so strange because later I read that famous passage by Robert Barclay about joining the silent assemblies of God's people, and I feel the evil drop away from me and the good raised up. That was my experience 300 years later from Robert Barclay. That was my experience of sitting in that silence and feeling like a participant for the first time. That I was part of a spiritual search. I wasn't part of the audience. And so I'm thinking about this inward nature of going in and listening to God, and then this outward impulse to enact it in the world, to what Steve Cary would say, to seek and do the will of God in all settings at all times. And so I'm getting that this is part of the deal with being a Quaker. It's a big deal. That's no easy thing. And so I ask, well, what is this faithfulness that you're talking about? What's it really mean? And so a guy goes to the 2 shelves of books, picks out George Fox's journal. What were these people thinking? Hands it to me, says, look at page 2. Page 2 is amazing. I recommend page 2. And it says that there are 3 great loves that people of faith, of true faithfulness, live by. And it's loving God with all your heart and soul and strength. It's loving your neighbor, including your enemy, as yourself. And here it is in the mid-1600s, and I'm a burgeoning environmentalist, just the seeds were coming up. And it says to love God's good earth and be in unity with creation. So for me, that is the vision of loving. That's the vision of faithfulness. That's what we're called to. And then I hear one more thing, and Cary talked about this too, and I loved it, is there was this thing called primitive Christianity. And so what's this primitive Christianity? And this fellow, Frank Young, who became my mentor, said, well, early Quakers had a different take on church history than most people do. Most people go, around the 4th century, the Christians finally convinced Constantine, the emperor of Rome, and converted him to Christianity. Quakers basically looked at that and said, no, unfortunately, the empire converted Christianity. And there was an imperial and perverse Christianity. And that Quakers were about going back to these loves, the way of Jesus. This notion of seek the kingdom of God first. So, given that Steve and I both love stories, and let me just pull out my clock and make sure I do something decent with our time. There's a story that haunts me, and I think it's because of King's role in my life and in this country. But it's a really cool story, and I think I mentioned it in the book, but it bears repeating, which is that in the mid-1980s in Seattle, in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, a bunch of people, these are small business people, church people, people working in NGOs, are going, we really want to raise up the legacy of Martin Luther King, of that faith-based activism, that persistence, that nonviolent resistance into creating something positive. We want that sort of known and talked about in our town. We want to inspire our young people that it's not just some distant guy. It can be us. It needs to be us. And so they did what a lot of communities do, which is they said, okay, we're going to change the name of the street that runs right through, the main street that runs through our neighborhood, to Martin Luther King Jr. way. And they did all the things community organizers would do. And it wasn't a tough sell in Seattle. After a couple of months, the city council said, great. And so at a Baptist church, there was a big celebration. And Vincent Harding, an associate of King's, an amazing theologian and one of, I think, the greatest historians of the civil rights movement, was asked to say a few words to sort of mark this victory. And there were some young people in the back kind of grumbling, and then they start sort of heckling Vincent. And they're saying, why are you old people getting so excited about changing the name of a street? We have much bigger problems than that. And Harding was great. He said, you know, you're absolutely right. And if we stopped at this, shame on us. We have so much work to do and we need to do it. But symbolism matters. And he says, so, what was the name of the street before we changed it? And the kid shouts back, the Empire Way. And Vincent said, so think about it. We have changed the road we travel every day, from the Empire Way to Martin's Way. From empire and domination and hierarchy and rank and exploitation to what King called the beloved community. And the two Steves, I think, are pretty much in agreement. That's a fundamental part of our faith. And if you go back, there's a great book recently, or somewhat recently, and I'm sure it's in the bookstore, but it's something called Quakers in the Kingdom of God, and it's talking about how important, though many different names were, the concept of we need to create a new way of life within history, a new way of community that's focused on justice and compassion and equality and the poor having enough. And not fighting with each other all the time or throwing people into prison all the time. And and I was shocked to learn because, you know, I thought all Quakers were sort of quiet pacifists for a little while. And they were talking about the Lamb's War. They were talking about a nonviolent spiritual revolution that would have political and economic consequences. And that's a little different than coming to meeting, feeling comfortable, being tolerant of all the people who are completely different from you. That's a calling. And what I get from Steve is that calling to change the road we travel from the Empire Way to Martin's Way. And I was delighted to read that Steve loved the Bible and loved Bible stories. He interpreted them in somewhat different ways than a lot of people in my little town in Illinois interpreted them. But he loved it. And I have too. And here is a quote from Hosea. He was pretty tough on people. And so this is thousands of years before 1968, my moment of coming to awareness of faith. The Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in this land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying, and murder, stealing and adultery. You break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land mourns, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, and the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea are dying. It is the exact opposite of loving God with all our heart and soul and strength. It is the exact opposite of loving our neighbors, including our enemies. And it is the exact opposite of loving God's good earth. And so, as I get more and more into studying these stories of creation, there are so many creation stories. There's more than two in Hebrew scripture. There's so many. And Exodus, and the prophets, and the Hebrews going, well, maybe we don't need earthly kings. And then they go, but everybody else has them, we want them. And Samuel going, talk to God, what am I going to do? He says, well, for God's sakes, don't have a king. You'll become cannon fodder. You'll become slaves. You don't have a king. Samuel goes back to the people. No, we want. And at this point, God decides to be a pretty creative educator, an experiential educator, and says, okay, try having a king. And the prophets called out on the problems of that. And so this is part of our history. And at a certain point, I was probably 15 or 16. I'm sitting in meeting for worship. And this would probably have been after I read a paper put out by a Quaker action group called Revolution, a Quaker prescription for a sick society, and with a group of people who later became Movement for a New Society. But I wasn't thinking about this, and I had this image of what is happening at meeting. And I had this image as people were coming in and sitting down. And I realized there are meetings all over the world. And what's happening is God is breathing in, gathering us all. And that meeting for worship is that moment where the breath is no longer coming in and it's not yet going out. And then, after the meeting for worship, God breathes out. And we all go into the world with our work to do, seeking and doing. And I'm sitting there, and in my head is revelation and revolution. Revelation and revolution. And I'm thinking, I know people. I bet most of us have probably heard, oh, well, there are the spiritual Quakers, and then there are the activist Quakers. And depending on who's saying it, it's like, well, there are the real Quakers, and then there are those secular goofballs, or there are those real Quakers, or the people who love to gaze at their navel and they won't do anything for justice. In that moment, I was going, and I ask you to do this now, as an experiment. Try just breathing in. How's it going? Okay, so that's tough. Try just breathing out. That doesn't work so well either. So maybe, just maybe, faithfulness is both the inward breath of touching and experiencing love, guidance, and presence of God. And faithfulness includes going out into the world. A world that is not that unlike what Hosea is talking about. A world that really needs not just marginal tinkering around the edges, but people to travel from their own hearts and in their own spheres of influence from the Empire Way to Martin's Way. And there's a quote that I found in Cary that's probably somewhere here. And it's not. But I think that was his genius as well. That he believed so deeply in meeting for worship and prayer and experiencing the eminence of God. And he'd get arrested for something that matters. And he would advise, there's a point where he's talking about the Poor People's Campaign, and he wasn't originally there. But there's a day to work on food stamps, and so they call him up, and that was what he was working on. So he goes to the Poor People's Campaign, and they start marching, I don't know if it was to the White House or to the Capitol, and the police line up and arrest him. And so he's in a 5 by 7 foot cell with 7 other people, and only 2 of them are white. And some of them are poor. And he goes, I really think more affluent white Quakers need to go and get arrested. I mean, because the Hebrew word for sin is very meaningful to me, and it's not necessarily, one end of the continuum is huge, horrendous, conscious, intent-filled evil. But the translation for sin in the Hebrew Scriptures is missing the mark. And so that means over on this side of the continuum, you can have denial, despair, distraction, which doesn't lead to much faithful action. It's sort of being a caring person, being a beautiful loser. Beauty is you never have to do anything. If you don't know things are bad, you have the choice. You have the luxury of not paying attention to these lives. If you do know they're bad, but you just go, there's nothing we really can do, you have the luxury of going, I am smarter than all those people in denial. But at least I don't have to do anything. Faithfulness means putting ourselves in play. It means being uncomfortable. It means having a happy adventure. Because in one moment, as he's writing about his time in that 5x7 cell, and it's about in the upper 90s, and there's 7 people there, and only a couple people can lay down at one time. And he is fully aware that this sucks. And he has never felt freer in his life. He has never felt more aligned with God and faithfulness in his life. And so when I think of Stephen Cary, I think back to my own boyhood hero, Martin Luther King. And what I discovered late in life is that in 1967, Martin Luther King was asked to go to the annual convention of the American Psychology Association and give the keynote address. Who knew? And he accepted. And I want to read a quote from that address. So imagine, it's 1967. It's not all psychologists, but most psychologists believe the goal of psychology is to make you well adjusted to the society around you. And King is on the stage. And he is dealing not with great evil. He's dealing with missing the mark through denial, distraction, and despair. And he says, you who are in the field of psychology have given us a great word. It is the word maladjusted. It is good, certainly, declaring that destructive maladjustment should be eradicated. But on the other hand, I am sure that we all recognize that there are some things in our society, some things in our world to which we should never be adjusted. There are some things we must always be maladjusted to if we are to be people of goodwill. We must never adjust ourselves to racial discrimination and racial segregation. We should never adjust ourselves to religious bigotry. We must never adjust ourselves to economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. We must never adjust ourselves to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. And he goes on talking a little longer. He said, basically, what we need is an international society for the cultivation of creative maladjustment. In my highest hope, when I think about the history of the Religious Society of Friends, I don't think we are the International Association for the Cultivation of Creative Maladjustment. But I think we're a denominational chapter. And later, in an earlier book, King in Strength to Love quotes Paul. And a lot of people don't like Paul, and there's this quibbling about, well, most of the stuff you don't like are in those 3 letters that a lot of scholars don't think he even wrote, so why worry about Paul? He said some good stuff. But Paul was one of the best community organizers that the Jesus movement had. And he goes and he helps organize a group in Rome, the belly of the biggest empire that the world has ever known. And he's writing them a letter. And I think it's amazing what he says. And think about this. Do not be conformed to this world. And when I first read this as a kid, I'm going, oh, this world, this is another person who hates nature. It's not the world he was talking about. He's talking about the world of empire. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you may discern what is the will of God. And so I have to ask us, have we become too well adjusted? Do we conform too much? Do we go along to get along? Do we just stay, not great evil, not the big nasty stuff, but the denial, the despair, the distraction that makes sure the nasty stuff will prevail? And Steve talked about this. He challenged the religious society of Friends. He asked us for a level of faithfulness that would take revelation and revolution and figure out creative ways to put them together. And he often talked about Gandhi, as Gandhi somehow figured out to take the spiritual and impulses of Jesus and translate them into strategic, effective movement building. And we don't even know where that could end, how far that can go. And one of the great lines, which I think moves completely outside of denial, despair, and distraction, is in Steve's final speech to the AFSC when he was stepping down as board chair. There's many things in that speech I recommend to all of you. But he said this: even though we are tiny, and even though there is a vast world to mend, it's important that we keep on witnessing to what love can do. And he talks in the book, and it scared me every time I read it. He said, the way of Jesus is not surefire success. You are not rationally calculating. If I do this, bingo, an outcome, great outcome, love it. And he's not saying, well, I've rationally concluded that there's no good that can be done there, so why bother? He just leaves it open. Let's see what love can do. And he talked when he was in Germany and Italy and Finland right after the war that he was seeing a level of devastation and human barbarism and despair that he hadn't seen. And he said, but I also saw these little miracles. These miracles of people helping each other. These miracles of people from different ethnic groups deciding that they would try for a while to trust each other and work together and solve some problems. And there's a guy named Derek Jensen who said, I want you all to give up hope. Because he defines hope in a very special way. He defines hope as waiting for somebody else to do what needs to be done. And then assuming that if somebody else does that, it's all going to be fine. He said, give up hope. And that's where he stopped. Cary goes one step further. It's not about hope. It's not about pessimism or optimism. It's what value can you add? What level of fledgling glimmer of Jesus' way of building a community of love and a kingdom and stretching and getting uncomfortable and actually learning some skills. Steve talked about we need people who are deeply spiritual, who will do things just because it's the right thing to do and it might turn out, And then he'd turn around, and I love this because that's my bias, and we have to be competent. And when I think of competent, part of it is getting uncomfortable. And I'm going to tell you this really stupid story. I have graduated, I don't have a bachelor's degree, but I have a master's and a PhD. And I went to both my graduations and I wore the big gowns. And now I'm a professor of advocacy for social justice and sustainability. And so for years, for 11 years, I've worn the gowns. And then I read, and I never thought about it. And then in the back page of the program is, well, where did this tradition come from? And the tradition came from setting up the clergy as quite distinct from the laity. It came from saying, we are better, we are more educated, we are the people who deserve, and you don't have these flashy robes with the 3 stripes. Not so much. And I felt a little like, and I don't know if the story is true, but William Penn saying, how long can I wear this sword? And George Fox going, as long as you can. And so I wore it 3 more years. And it troubled me. And I decided I can't do it anymore. And so this year, I dressed in these clothes. I was trying to be respectful. And I walked up there, and I'm feeling foolish. I'm going, none of this will change me. It's just symbolism. But it puts me in an uncomfortable place. It puts me in thinking about where did these habits, where did these customs come from? And it reminded me of the early Friends. Quakers didn't do it. That was not cool. There was flowery speech and using the fancy speech of you instead of thee for your superiors. You know, part of me goes, why bother? It's just a habit of speech. But embedded in it was, this isn't faithful. This is not the way of Jesus. This is the way of empire. And so we're going to only use one kind of speech. And so I think, and I've railed against this. I used to go, oh, all this individual concern about sort of integrity, blah, blah, blah. We need to get out there and make change. Can't worry about this little stuff. Frankly, I was wrong. That was me believing that you can have revolution, real revolution that would be great without revelation, without personal responsibility. But at the same time, where we need to get faithful and competent, Gandhi talked about 3 different ways to make change in public life. And one is essentially what might be called normal channels. And so that would be elections and lobbying and litigation. And if you're in the Indian independence movement under British imperialism, you don't have any of those levers. But Gandhi was wise enough to say, if you happen to live in a country that has some of those levers, that there's still something that can be done democratically that way, by all means, don't be crazy, use it. And then the way he's most known for is what Gandhi called the resistance program. And this is something that Quakers also know a bit about. And that's where people refuse to cooperate. Hopefully in masses, hopefully organized. But it sometimes starts out small with 1 or 2 people refusing. But this changes power dynamics. And the part that he's less well known for is what he called the constructive program, which is you don't wait for permission. You start changing customs, changing institutions, making new institutions that meets people's needs, that are socially just, that bind the community together. And so, as I'm getting close to closing, think about our past. Think about our present, because there are faithful Quakers doing all these things. And I know there are, because I see so many of you in this room, and I know we're doing these 3 things out of a sense of faith and calling. But we have to be realistic. We have to look at ourselves. There's an essay in here, which I guess it's a talk that he's giving to Haverford students, and the last part of it is self-examination. And what he's asking for is honest self-examination about, are we being faithful? Or are we just a little bit off? Just a little bit off the mark. Not much, just a little bit. And we have been that. We have been faithful and we have been radically unfaithful. And I remember when I was a youngster just learning about Quakers, Frank Young, who was sort of my hero and mentor, and he tells me one day about how excited and proud he was that Quakers were the first religious denomination in the United States to decide slavery was a sin and to give it up. And at first I'm going, well, that's cool. And then I'm going, wait, Quakers ever owned slaves? What is up with that? And I learned about what was up in that by reading Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship. And I think this is a really huge cautionary tale for us to really think deeply about. So friends, and this is a quote, friends in the early 1700s were likely to view enslavement from 4 perspectives. A majority of Quakers accepted slavery. A majority of Quakers conformed to this imperial world. A majority of Quakers were extremely well adjusted to the society around them. And they had not much qualm or question. Others were perplexed, troubled, but did nothing. Still others agreed with George Fox that slaves should be treated kindly and offered a Christian education, a line of thought that did not embrace emancipation. It would be like the Slavery Protection Agency. And finally, a sensitive few doubted if Christians should be enslaving their fellow men. And that sensitive few became the sensitive many. And it took over 100 years. And only about 10% of Quakers, even after they gave up slaves, would engage in boycotting slave goods, slave-made goods. Less of a percentage would join with their neighbors in abolition societies. And when they did, other Quakers would go, you're being too worldly. You're being too secular. And they were often kicked out of their meetings. And so, think for a moment that we live in a time of tremendous injustice. We live in a time of climate change that's going to be hugely disruptive. And that many people are taking seriously this notion that our industrial way of life is not sustainable as is. Think about what unsustainable means. It means it can't last. And if the society that we've grown accustomed to can't last, and if the options are to create some sort of horrible eco-fascism that keeps us exploiting the earth at a rational level that doesn't kick us in the ass, but means that we have to treat people really badly, this is the call of our time. And we have to respond much more faithfully than Quakers did around slavery. And I kind of think the time is a little ticking, and I don't think we have 100 years even to get to first base here. So, imagine God breathing in, that moment of silence, of revelation, and God breathing out. And I want each of us to spend a little time thinking, how can I cultivate revelation? revelation? How can I cultivate nonviolent revolution in the beloved community? How can I cultivate divine presence, love, and guidance in my life? How can I show that in the world in meaningful and intelligent ways? How can I be soulful and confident? I want to close with Cary talking again to the students at Haverford. It's really interesting. You know, he describes why he left the service committee and went into education. And part of it, God bless his honesty, he said, I was passed over for the top job 3 times and I was just getting tired. And he was tired of traveling so often and the impact it had on Betty and the family. And the most recent trip was 3 months in Southeast Asia. And that's a long time to be away. But he also had this glimmer that the service committee had trouble finding people, not that were competent, they could find competent people, but they had trouble finding people who had that kind of magical something. The miracle workers who would bring more than competence, but would be soul. And so he said, I want to go to a place like Haverford, which I know and love. And I think it has the capacity to do the spiritual formation of young people who can be both competent and soulful, who can both have revelation and revolution. And so this is what Cary has to say about spiritual formation. And I think in our spiritual communities, in our meetings, this question is for us. And here's his question. Can we shape it so that we build in you a restless uneasiness with the status quo? A faith that you can do something to change it. And a commitment to be about the business of doing it. And since I started with stories, I just want to end with the last one, which is when I moved from book learning in a very small way to doing what Steve Cary did so often, which was go and see the impact on people of different things. And I led a study trip with 12 students to Louisiana, and it was called Environmental Justice in the Mississippi Delta. And we're reading ahead of time before we go down there that about 25% of the petrochemical that are domestically produced, so an enormous amount of wealth is being generated, are produced in what the State Chamber of Commerce calls the chemical corridor, which is from Baton Rouge, the 87 miles of the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And there's 156 petrochemical plants on both sides. Massive wealth, and Louisiana is the poorest state in the union. Is that just? And it has the second poorest public health record. And we were also reading that about 34% of the people who live in Louisiana are African American. Along the, quote, chemical corridor, but when we got there, we found out the local people called it Cancer Alley. The percentage of black people living right next to those plants was close to 90 to 95%. It's a huge disproportionate impact. And so we go and visit a woman named Margie Richard, who is a recent recipient of the Golden Prize. And for those of you who are environmentalists, it's like the big international prize for grassroots environmentalists. And so I go in, we park the van at Margie's house, I knock the door, she opens it, we go in, we sit at her table, and she starts telling me some stories. And I said, well, don't tell too many of them, let's get in the van. And she says, okay, but just pray with me. And so she reads me this passage from the Bible, and then we go get in the van. And we go to Diamond, Louisiana, where her family has lived for generations. And there was a predominantly white part of the neighborhood, and I think in the early 90s, the Shell Oil Company paid all the white neighbors this oil refinery and petrochemical plant top dollar on their house so they could move out of harm's way. And they offered nothing to the African American community. Margie was a retired school teacher. At this time, she would have been, in her early 70s. When I knew her, she was in her 80s. And so she's taking us around the neighborhood. And she's saying, that's where I used to live, and it's a vacant lot. And she tells the story of how she got Shell to finally pay enough money for her neighbors to move out of harm's way. And there's a poignancy in what she's saying, because yes, we got out of harm's way, but they came in the 1950s. We've been here for generations and generations. We had to leave. Why did we have to leave? But she tells the story, an amazing organizing story that took her to Europe to a shareholders meeting, where she walked up to the shareholders and put water from the wells by that town in front of them and asked them to drink. And they didn't drink. And so she finally won. And so my students are there. We are in a playground that's still standing, and the back fence is the borderline fence to the petrochemical plant. And there's a sign that's still up that says, "Parents, make sure your children are safe." You cannot play in that playground and have your children be safe. Within 20 minutes, our eyes were watering. Half of us had headaches. One of the students had to go lay down in the van because she was so nauseous. Within 20 minutes, imagine 24/7. And she tells the story about how they slept in their clothes. So when the alarms went off in the middle of the night, they could run. But she won. She organized, she did community organizing, got her neighbors, and she won. And one of my students said, "Margie, you just went up against the second most powerful corporation in the world, and you won an important victory. How did you ever imagine that was possible? What kept you going?" And she looked at it, and this was quite startling to my Northeast, largely secular environmental studies students. She said, "Oh, honey, if Jesus can die on the cross for me, I can damn well take care of the babies in my neighborhood." Thank you. Some time.
Thank you for your ministry. Are you up for some questions? So if there are questions for Steve, I'm just going to ask that you speak into the microphone.
I have an environmental question. When you spoke of timing, you said we darn well don't have 100 years. I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts on what kind of timing we do have and what kind of work we should be doing within what time frame.
I always worry a little anytime I say, we don't have the same time as that 100 years. Because basically we have all the time that we have available. And it's easy to say, well, in a perfect world, we would live the way we're living now. And I used to get so mad at the present. How could it possibly be that? And more, I'm just going, I only care, not so much fighting with the past, but what can we do now that has half a chance to make things better? With a sense of urgency, but also a realization, species have died before. And I don't want that. I want us to be a very successful species, but I would just say that when I see my students trying to calculate the time, here's what I worry about. I see them calculating the time to see if it makes any sense to try to do anything. And if they can convince themselves that there's no hope, They get the beauty of being right, but they don't have the chance to be effective. So I don't mean to slither around your question, but we don't know for sure. I mean, there are different stories about imminent collapse, slow decline, coming up with some creative alternatives. And so I just think we have to think about, in my sphere of influence, what could I offer that helps make a spiritually fulfilling, socially just, and ecologically sustainable world? Is that a horribly unsatisfying answer?
Well, no, but I do think that I like the part about remembering about the hope and not allowing that to interfere. But I guess knowing what your thoughts would be on maybe not timing, because I kind of anticipated an answer like the one I got.
Yeah,
but,
a lot of people slip like that.
But what if I feel an urgency, and I understand about the sphere of influence and so forth, I have to make some choices about that energy that I'm going to put into that sphere. And I was looking for some insight, which you've given me in other areas tonight, and I was hoping for some insight in that area. I'm sorry to continue.
Yeah. Well, my basic take, and this again might be unsatisfying, is that there's no magic silver bullet that's solving everything if we just load it up and fire it, that we're going to have to try lots of different things. I know there are people here from Quaker Action Team, and those people astonish me with their creativity and what they're doing. I spend more of my time working in the transition movement, and that's where that's more like Gandhi's constructive program writ large. It's, all right, if we have to make a transition from oil dependency and fossil fuels to resilient local economies, because in the future, maybe even 20 years, maybe less, having a carrot travel 1,200 miles before it gets from the farm to the plate is not going to be that viable. And so people are thinking about, well, how do you create local co-ops? How do you create time banks? How do you create community-supported agriculture? How do you create a renaissance in local business? And some of the communities are all doing what I think is one of the most creative strategies, and it's come out of Pennsylvania. How many people here know about, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund? It is some of the most crazy, wonderful organizing that's happening right now. And so this is an example, a guy named Tom Lindsay, who he says, and he can get away with it given where he grew up, but he says, well, in Pennsylvania, you've got Philadelphia on one side, you've got Pittsburgh on the other, and you have Mississippi in the middle. He was an Alabama boy, but he whacked Mississippi. And so they were doing very traditional regulatory public interest law. He's one of 200 public interest lawyers in the country. 200, that's it. And they would win case after case after case, and then the unwanted land use, the factory farms and things were still being put in place, because then they were doing the work of cleaning up the permit adoption, and the companies would go, great, now we know where the document was at. And what they have done is they've started passing laws locally that in our town, corporations are not allowed to own factory farms, or to own farms or operate them. In our town, corporations are not allowed to operate quarries. In our town, and we have this in New Hampshire and in Maine, corporations are not allowed to extract water from the aquifer to sell bottled water. And then they have little things in them saying, and in our town, corporations do not have constitutional rights that have been described since the late 1800s by the Supreme Court. And some of these towns have, and in our town, anybody who lives in our town has legal standing to defend the rights of nature. Now, 80% of the people in Pennsylvania who have voted for these things voted for George Bush, senior and junior. They are like 99% white. But you convert an environmental issue from parts per million and dueling lawyers and scientists, and you start talking about local control and whether 5 people, a majority of a corporate board, thousands of miles away, gets to decide the future of our town, or the majority of people who live here. And I think that's where things start getting, it's not just overdoing good, that's getting kind of revolutionary. And if some of the people who are passing the most anti-corporate rule legislation anywhere in this country are these rural conservatives, we have coalition opportunities like you wouldn't believe. So, but it's funny, I've asked a number of Quakers in Pennsylvania, have you ever heard of this? And it's been going on for about 7 years. They were also asked by the Ecuador government when they were doing their constitution, and they helped advise putting the rights of nature, the only national constitution on the planet that has the rights of nature enshrined in a constitution. So that's pretty creative, but I'm jabbering.
Hey, Steve. As you look at the social and political landscape in which we live and in which we want to bring about this revolutionary change with regard to the earth and creation, can you say a bit more about, first of all, looking at that whole landscape, how important you think it is to be faith-based? And also, if you think it is important to be faith-based, what's the place of Jesus or what's the place of Scripture?
Yeah.
For those, given what we all pretty much acknowledge about most of us Quakers as part of it.
Well, Frank Young, my mentor when I was an early Quaker, I asked him one time, why do Quakers put so much time talking about following Jesus, and they spend so little time talking about believing specific things about Jesus? And that was true in my town. He laughed, and I always loved his answer. Well, I've read the Gospels, I've read Paul's letters, I've never once seen Jesus recorded as saying, if you want to live a faithful life, you have to believe my mother was a virgin and I'm God. What Jesus usually said, be compassionate, as God is compassionate. And so I have to tell you, I left the Society of Friends for about 25 years. And when I left, I was thinking of what King said about power without love is abuse. And love without power is anemic sentimentality. And at that point in my life, in my mid-20s, I'm going, wow, Quakers are awash in anemic sentimentality. And so I became a serpent-smart politico. You know, when Jesus was asked one time how to be faithful, he said, be as gentle as a dove and as clever as a serpent, and that mixing thing. And I went one side of that. I was serpent smart, I was all about strategy, and I was getting brittle, and I was getting hard, I was getting tired, I was getting despairing, I was treating people badly, I was calling out names. And when in my mid to late 40s and I had my spiritual reawakening, I'm a much more effective activist now. And so, do we all have to believe the same things? No. But do we have to is there an opportunity for people of faith to be part of these larger movements and make sure that where there's power, there's love? And to help make sure from that prophetic, tough voice of Hosea that where there's love, we're not going to forget the power. And that balance is something that I think is sorely needed. And I have lost it many times in my life. And I know other people have lost it on the other side of the equation. I tend to lose it on this side of the equation. But we have so much we can do together if we find that middle ground together. So, hopefully.
Thank you. You were coming to the end of your talk before the last story. And something rose in me and I said to myself, as much as I love you and such, I wish you had started here. I wish you had started at the place that talked about now is the time to begin seriously with all of that love. And I wonder, in addition to some of what you've offered, you might share some more about what you would invite us into in order that we can step clearly, faithfully in the balance.
I have no idea if this is useful, but what's coming up is do some real soul searching. Really question about how well adjusted we are. To get to know people that make you crazy uncomfortable. I walked in to a service area on a highway on the way down here. And I'm walking behind a guy who has a t-shirt that said the American Border Patrol. And I had a quote from Ernest Hemingway about the joys of hunting men with guns. And I wanted to yell, I wanted to scream, I chickened out, I didn't do anything. But that would have been an interesting conversation. And part of what I think, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, because I think when Steve Cary and the American Friends Service Committee came out in the mid-50s with Speak Truth to Power, that was amazing. That was really amazing. But I think what happens now is that it's too easy to stay in this role of, well, we'll speak truth to power, because what that means is, I've done my bit, I dissented. What about having truthful conversations with our neighbors? What about figuring out ways to solve problems? Not to have done our bit to be dissenters, but to be true organizers. I mean, I think about Jesus and the apostles, they were community organizers, faith-based community organizers. And there's a lot we can learn from that tradition. And in the transition organizing work that I do in Keene, New Hampshire, Katie, my partner, and I came up with this game that we've played over and over in bars, in church basements, in schools. And the game asks people to imagine it's 2033. And they're broken up into small groups. And some people are given local food, some people are given the tag local business, other people are doing green energy, health. And so they're saying, well, good news is it was rough, but a halfway decent transition happened. And it's been going on for at least 20 years. So what I want you in the next 20 minutes is that in your small group, come up with a news skit from 2013 saying what the latest good news achievement is. And then after people do that, and the conversation takes off, people are unleashed. How many times do people get to think about vision? Or think about what they want their town to be, or what they really care about, and they get creative, and they're laughing, and they're excited. And it's much easier to organize for a vision than to, try to stop the juggernaut. And then I get them up, I pretend to be the MC, and they each get 5 minutes to do their show. And people are inspired by each other. And it's this silly game that starts a conversation where people step out of ordinary reality and think about the future and the kind of work they want. And I'll often ask the question at the end, how many of you want to live in a world that's spiritually fulfilling, socially just, and environmentally sustainable? Everybody raises their hand. There is such a reservoir, an untapped reservoir of potential. And so the more we tap it into each other and encourage it, I think it's a really good thing. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, when I'm the MC and I'm closing out after the 5 or 6 different 5-minute schedule, I said, well, tune in next week when we'll have more good news from the Monadnock region. And remember, folks, the best way to predict the future is to make it. That, I think, is
I think that's the right note for us to end on. I want to thank you so much for your message this evening.
Thank you all so much.
That's right. Thank you for coming. You're welcome to stay here and discuss this message.